Section 23 of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8. Literature, Part 1. Literature had undergone already a substantial reform at the hands of Malherbe. After the eccentricities of the school of Ronsard, and the absurd attempts made by the members of the Pléiade to deprive the French language of its national character, a reaction was inevitable, and it was conducted with a great deal of tact and of good sense by the poet whom its detractors affected to style le tyran des mots et des syllabes. Enfin, Malherbe vint, says Boileau, and there is no doubt that Malherbe's influence over the grammar and the structure of the language was of the most beneficial description. Unfortunately, his genius was not equal to his critical talent. He had neither imagination nor fancy, and candidates for literary fame thought that he did not make sufficient allowance for these two last qualities. The vicissitudes of war, political marriages, and other circumstances had brought about frequent intercourse between France on the one hand, and Italy and Spain on the other. The literary masterpieces of these two countries had found their way to Paris across the Pyrenees and the Alps, and the question soon suggested itself to the habitués of fashionable drawing-rooms, whether the high-sounding phrases of Lope de Vega and Diamante on the one side, and the concetti of the Cavalier Marino on the other, were not superior to the stilted productions of Malherbe. Hence, two schools of writers in France, corresponding with the reign of Louis XIII, the one represented by Voiture and the other by Balzac. Both rose to immediate popularity from totally different causes, and became the idols of the Paris salon, or of the assemblies corresponding to what we should now call salons. After the end of the wars of religion, and when French society had settled down into the enjoyment of refined and intellectual pleasures, a number of fashionable centres were formed, presided over by ladies of taste and fashion, all equally characterized by the love of literature, but differing from each other in their minor features, according to the special disposition of the mistress of the house. Before inquiring into the subjects of the conversations and discussions carried on in these réunions, let us endeavour to form some idea of the part of Paris where fashion and wit used to assemble. During the last century, the Faubourg Saint-Germain was the great centre. Now the Champs-Élysées and its neighbourhood holds the sway. 200 years ago, no one who had any feeling of self-respect would have dreamed of residing elsewhere than in the Ile Saint-Louis or the Place Royale especially. When you entered that square, says Viscount d'Avenel, by its real approach the Rue Royale near the Rue Saint-Antoine, you found on the right-hand side the Hôtel de Rouen, on the left the Hôtel de Chaulnes, the splendid apartments of which have been celebrated by Bois-Robert, and which has since become the property of the Nicolai family. At the angles, near the Rue de Tournelle, stood the Hôtel de Saint-Géron, de Nouveau, now used as a mairie town hall, the hotel of the Countess de Moor, and that of the Marchioness de Sable. Further on lived Président de l'Escalopier, in a house which has until quite recently belonged to the family of its original owners. The square consisted of 37 pavilions supported by a covered gallery. Several acts of Corneille's monture and of his Place Royale allude to the conversations which took place under the arcades. In the former of these plays, Cliton, Doran's servant, familiar with Parisian usages, speaking of a lady, says, "Elle loge à la place, et son nom est Lucrèce." That would be quite sufficient under the reign of Louis XIII to designate La Place Royale. Just as when we now say Le Bois, it means exclusively Le Bois de Boulogne. Scarron, a few years later on, said, Adieu, belle place où n'habite commande personne d'élite. It is probably in the Place Royale, says Monsieur Cousin, that Descartes, chatting with Pascal, suggested to him his fine experiments on the atmosphere. There also Detou, on leaving Madame de Guémenet's salon, received from Saint-Mars the information about the conspiracy which was to bring him to the scaffold. During the reign of Louis XIII, several salons enjoyed successively the patronage of the fashionable world. They owed their popularity to the courtesy and accomplishments of the master and mistress of the house, the refined manners they encouraged and of which they set the example, the tone of the conversations, and the character of the guests. All these circumstances helped to establish that popularity and to make it lasting. Marshal Bassompierre was amongst the first to have at-homes of that kind. His house was the rendezvous of the 17 noblemen, 17 seigneurs. Nothing was more agreeable than the decent freedom which prevailed there. No ceremony whatever. Everyone sat down where he happened to be, and those who came in the latest took their place at the table, although the others had been there long before. As the guests came in without saying good day, so they left without saying good bye, some soon, some late, according to their business. 15 years afterwards, the Duchesse de Beauharn's reunions took the place of Bassompierre's. She allowed exactly the same liberty. In fact, if we may believe Talmont de Réau, she contributed in no slight degree to make young men lose the respect formerly paid to ladies, for in order to draw them into her coterie, she allowed them to take every kind of liberty. Montglat talks of the Messieurs de Marais, name given to the part of Paris where the Place Royale is situated, who used to assemble every evening at the house of Madame de Rohan. Saint-Mars belonged to that society, and preferred it to the Louvre. The Comtesse de Soissons had her levée at the Hôtel de Créqui. The Princesse de Condé held hers at the Hôtel de Ventadour. There was a great rivalry between these two groups. The habitués of the one would scarcely condescend to notice those of the other, and, to use a military expression, kept on terms of armed neutrality. History, however, has forgotten the 17 seigneurs, the Messieurs de Marais, and the other centres of more fashionable life, and has immortalized merely the salon where literature was cultivated. Those we mean of Madame de Rambouillet and of Mademoiselle de Scudéry. Had it not been for them, the précieuse style would never have remained so long and so much in repute. We should not have seen springing up, not only in Paris, but from one end of France to the other, those innumerable societies, humble and unpretending on the one hand, ambitious and refined on the other, which contributed in a remarkable manner to spread, even in the lowest classes of the bourgeoisie, a taste for intellectual pursuits. It is true that exaggeration and affectation were one of the results of this movement, but we find here only an additional evidence of the genuine good which such societies produced, and we must always remember that what is really worthless does not often run the chance of being caricatured. Mademoiselle de Scudéry's Samedi have had due honour paid to them by M. Victor Cousin and M. Sainte-Beuve. There might be found Madame Cornuelle, Madame de Sévigné, Conrart, Ménage, Pélisson, etc., etc. There was planned and designed the famous Carte du Tendre, in which the vocabulary of love was made to sound like the articles of a gazetteer. There the various habitués, assuming names borrowed from classical antiquity, paraded about their high-flown language under the protection of Greek and Latin designations. Mademoiselle de Scudéry herself was Sappho, l'illustre Sappho, or la 10e Meuse. Sarrazin, Polyander. Conrart, Deodama. Pélisson, Acanthe, or the chronicler, because he was the secretary of the society. The Duc de Saint-Aignan became Artaban. Monsieur de Rancy agathirs, and isarn xenocrate. Conrar has preserved the account of one of these samedi. He has offered to the fair hostess a signet made of crystal, together with a madrigal of his own composition. She answered by another madrigal, and all the other persons present, fired with enthusiasm, followed suit. The day was called La Journée des Madrigaux. The most notable of these reunions was held at the Hôtel de Rambouillet, in that famous Salon Bleu, where round the Marchioness de Rambouillet assembled the bevy of précieux and précieuses. It is unfortunate that for the great majority of readers, the guests of the incomparable Art Denis should be associated with the Philaminte and the Bélises of the Femmes Savantes, or the Cathos and Madelons of the Précieuses Ridicules. But if the blue stockings of those days were not sparing enough in their use of metaphors, it cannot be denied that they did excellent service as reformers of the French language, and Saumais's Grand Dictionnaire des Précieuses is an invaluable source of information respecting the origin of many expressions which have retained their place in the French vocabulary. How often, for instance, do we say of a person who keeps low company, "Cet homme sans canaille"? And yet this expression, at the time when it was first used, was considered as perfectly ridiculous. In Molière's Critique de l'École des Femmes, we find the following curious dialogue. Climene. Il est vrai que le goût des gens est étrangement gâté là-dessus, et que le siècle s'encanaille furieusement. Élise. Celui-là est joli encore, s'encanaille. Est-ce que vous qui l'avez inventé, madame? Climene. Hein! Élise. Je m'en suis bien douté. A large number of words and phrases shared the fate of s'encanailler. Denounced at first as affected and unnatural, they gradually obtained, so to say, their rights of citizenship. N'avoir que le masque de la vertu, être sobre dans ses discours, tenir bourreau d'esprit, and many other expressions which we might quote are of like origin, and must not be flung aside on the plea that when Mademoiselle de Scudéry wanted the servant to snuff a candle, she exclaimed, "Inutile! Retranchez le superflu de cet ardent." Literary and social gatherings speedily multiplied in Paris. At the Hôtel de Condé, at the Palais Cardinal, the merits of a sonnet, a madrigal, or an epigram were laboriously discussed. At the Luxembourg, Mademoiselle de Montpensier and her guests, anticipating upon La Bruyère and Vauvenargues, delighted in writing characters or portraits of each other. Madame de Sablé's salon was frequented by the Jansenists of Port-Royal. Ménage, ridiculed by Molière under the name of Vadius, tried to give to his Mercurial Wednesday reunions an air of sprightliness and wit which was not the usual features of his character. But if the Hôtel de Rambouillet stood facile princeps at the head of the aristocratic drawing-rooms, the salon of Mademoiselle de Scudéry easily carried off the palm amongst those which represented the intellectual and cultivated bourgeoisie. The illustrious Sappho, as she was called, has often and deservedly perhaps been the butt of satire on account of her long-winded romances, but we must remember that our point of view cannot be the same as that occupied by the critics 2 centuries ago, and making every allowance for the tediousness of Le Grand Sirou and Clélie, Histoire Romaine, the lady who numbered amongst her supporters persons such as Madame de Sévigné, La Fontaine, Huet, Fléchier, Bossuet, the Duc de Montausier, must have had some literary merit to justify her popularity. We cannot help giving one brief paragraph to the brother of the famous Madeleine, Georges, who was the braggadocio of 17th century literature, who would have run a critic through with his rapier, and felt that by doing so he was merely avenging the dignity of his profession. Boileau's appreciation of him is well known. Bien heureuse Scudéry, dont la fertile plume peut tous les mois sans peine enfanter en volume. Tes écrits, il est vrai, sans art et languissants, semblent être formés en dépit du bon sens. Mais ils trouvent pourtant quoi qu'on en puisse se dire, en marchant pour les vendre et des sots pour les lire. His most celebrated works are his tragedies, Ligue d'Amont, 1629, L'amour tyrannique, 1638, and an epic poem, Alaric, where a few felicitous couplets disappear under the influence of surrounding absurdities. The share which the Hôtel de Rambouillet had in reforming and enriching French literature has been variously estimated. Whilst Viscount d'Avenel is rather inclined to depreciate it, M. Roederer, Histoire de la Société Polie, falls, we believe, into the opposite exaggeration. The truth, as usual, is to be found midway. If this celebrated salon had had only the result of introducing to the noblesse the aristocracy which results from genius and talent, it would deserve a distinguished place in the annals of belles lettres. We are told that the apparition of Voiture's sonnet on Job and Benserrade's on Uranie was an event quite as important as the battles of Lens and of Rocroi, and this fact alone shows to what dignity the position of a man of letters had risen then. We must not forget, too, that the real précieux and précieuses were not those whom Molière dragged on the stage in his amusing comedy, and this is so true that when the précieuses ridicules appeared on the stage for the first time, the whole of the habitués of the Hôtel de Rambouillet went to see the performance, and were the loudest in cheering the author. Madame de Sévigné herself used to boast of the title, feeling conscious that Molière's satire could only be levelled at clumsy and pedantic imitators. All the intellectual centres we have just enumerated were governed by the laws of the strictest propriety. Although gentlemen were permitted to act the innamorato's part, and to be thoroughly acquainted with Mademoiselle de Scudéry's famous Carte du Tendre, yet their passion must be of the purest and most platonic kind possible. In fact, the coarseness and the licentiousness of the 16th century had brought about a reaction verging upon the grotesque. This hardly suited a society of young men such as Saint-Amand, Théophile de Villot, Farret, who, like their intellectual forefathers, Villon, Regnier, etc., were fonder of Epicureanism than of sentiment. So, as a sort of protest against the Colle Monte style of the Chambre Bleue and of Sappho's Saturdays, cabarets d'honneur were opened for the benefit of the bohemians of literature, and there poems were read and drinking songs composed, which, if not generally distinguished by refinement, frequently contained a sparkling couplet or two, a touching passage, and a delicate thought neatly expressed. Thus Villon, Mais où sont les neiges d'antan? finds its counterpart in Saint-Amand's lines, Les épais promenoirs de ces vertes allées, où tant d'afflictions ont été consolées. We have thus attempted to give a slight idea of the various endeavours made to restore in France the spirit of sociability, combining with it the taste for intellectual pursuits. Voiture's wit, incessantly sparkling like a display of fireworks, but quite as unsubstantial, resulted in all the puerilities of the précieuse literature, and it is a pity that a man who could write such letters as the Lettres de la Carpe au Brochet and the Lettres sur la prise de Corbie should have wasted his time upon riddles, jokes, and puns. The prose of Balzac, on the other hand, stilted, artificial, and elaborate, tended to destroy every spontaneity in composition, and under the pen of a mere imitator would become utter nonsense. In Molière's comedy Les Femmes Savantes, the couplet Ne dis plus qu'il est amarante, dis plutôt qu'il est demarante is a specimen of the worst Voiture. The amusing speech of Thomas Diaphorus in the Malade Imaginaire reminds us a little of Balzac. The contrast between the character of Voiture and that of Balzac is quite as amusing as that which we find between their respective talents. The former might perhaps be accused of wanting dignity, but on the other hand, how agreeable he was, how kind, how unselfish. With Balzac, the case is quite different, and his style is the best clue perhaps to his moral nature. Eaten up with vanity, he sees nothing beyond himself, and the admiration, the engouement which he inspires, causes him to believe that he really is a paragon of perfection. Contemporary writers inform us that out of politeness he always took off his hat when he spoke about himself, which accounted for the fact that he so often suffered from cold in the head. Referring to the death of his father, he one day said in a letter, "Since I last wrote to you, I have lost that good-natured old father of mine, mon bonhomme de père." Of course, he was never married. The cares and anxieties which accompany family life would have proved too great a trial for his intense selfishness. "I do not want," says he, "to be obliged to count every day the hairs of my wife, in order to feel quite sure that she is faithful. As for children, if they are ill-disposed and wicked, they will long after my death. If they happen to be good, they will expect it, at any rate, and think of it sometimes, even supposing they were the best principled children in the world. I will have none of that." Balzac, so heartless and indifferent about home affections, is quite as careful not to allow patriotism and philanthropy to disturb his repose. "We should never have done," says he, "if we wished to take to heart the concerns of this world, or feel anxious for the good of the public of which we form only a very small part. If we regard all men as our relatives, we must make up our mind to wear mourning all our life long." These sentiments are very different from Terence's homo sum, and if it is true that genuine eloquence rises from the heart, Balzac was not eloquent. End of section 23. Section 24 of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8, Literature, Part 2. Voiture was essentially a man of the world. He loved society, and was never so happy as when surrounded by all the minor stars of the Hôtel de Rambouillet. Balzac habitually lived away from Paris, on the principle, no doubt, that maior a longinquio reverentia. The fact is that he had been, he thought, slighted by Richelieu, and his vanity was sorely wounded. He retired to an estate he possessed in the province of Angoumois, but he took care at the same time to keep himself constantly before the public. He represents himself as perfectly besieged by applications for letters which circulated about from salon to salon, exciting universal admiration and forming the subject both of the talk and jealousy of all other aspirants after literary fame. "At the very moment when I am now addressing you," we still quote, "I have on my table 100 letters awaiting answers. There are some from crowned heads. My friends insist upon eloquent answers, answers fit to be shown, handed about, copied, printed." Balzac's chief works are Le Socrate chrétien, Le Prince, et Les Entretiens à Ménandre, in which he gave, before Pascal, the example of a serious and impartial style of controversy. In one word, Balzac is a perfect artist, but his writings never betray that feeling which makes us love the man. One of the most famous of the literary meetings of the early 17th century in France was that which sat at the house and under the auspices of the Protestant Valentin Conrart, whom we have already alluded to more than once. He was a man of great judgment, of the most unblemished reputation, and he enjoyed the esteem and friendship of the best known writers of the day. Being on intimate terms with Balzac, Godot and other literary characters who shared his taste for intellectual pursuits. He was fond of discussing with them all sorts of subjects bearing upon history, science, philosophy, and belles-lettres. In 1629, in order to give to these meetings greater regularity, he proposed to his friends that they should assemble at his house once a week. These gatherings lasted in the first instance for the space of 4 years. In 1634, however, having married Mademoiselle Muisson and accepted the post of secretary to the king, Conrart felt obliged to close the literary reunions which he had originated and carried on with so much success, and the members of the society assembled afterwards, sometimes at the house of Desmarets, the well-known author of the comedy Les Visionnaires, sometimes at the poet Chapelain. It was then that a code of statutes was drawn up for the society, and 3 officers were appointed to manage its transactions. Of these officers, 2 were annually chosen, the chancellor and the director. The third, the secretary, was elected for life, and by an act of courtesy, which was certainly well deserved, this post was given to Conrart. It had been resolved at first that the meetings of the Academy should be kept secret, and for some time the resolution was strictly adhered to. But experience has more than once proved that such promises are never of long duration, especially when as many as 40 persons are concerned in it, and Malville, one of the academicians, having mentioned it to a literary friend of his, Farret, the news got to the ears of Boisrobert, a man perfectly forgotten now, but who in 1634 was one of the most prominent oracles of the day, and enjoyed the confidence of Cardinal Richelieu. If we believe Guy Paton, Boisrobert, although a beneficed clergyman, was notorious for the irregularity of his life. He had all the qualities of a thorough Epicurean, combined with a certain taste for literature and a spirit of repartee, which rendered him a great favourite at the Palais Cardinal. But even Richelieu could not resist the irritation which Boisrobert's scandalous behaviour created in the public, and he resolved upon dismissing him from his presence. The separation was a sad one, and if satisfaction had been given to the susceptibility of the religious Parisians, how, on the other hand, would the Prime Minister manage to get on without the company of the wit who amused him so regularly by his anecdotes, and caused him to forget the cares of politics and the burden of state difficulties? Feeling very unwell one day, he sent for his physician, who, after giving him a prescription, added, "Monseigneur, all our drugs will prove useless if you do not add to them 1 dose of Boisrobert." The advice was followed at once, and one of the first pieces of gossip which the restored favourite told his master was that of the creation and organization of Conrart's Academy. The idea, he said, seemed to him a most useful one. It would encourage a taste for intellectual pursuits, and be most probably the means of introducing to the notice of the public Monseigneur's own dramatic compositions, the glory of the age and the pride of France. The intelligence thus given by Boisrobert to the Prime Minister came very opportunely. When Cardinal Richelieu heard about these conversaziones, he saw at once both the dangers which might arise from them if they became political clubs, and the assistance that they might give him if he wished to press eloquence and learning in the service of his own ambitious views. He accordingly sent one of his agents to sound these gentlemen, and to ask them whether they would not like to form a regular body, and to meet at stated times under the sanction of public authority. His proposition was very coolly received. Most of Conrart's friends would have far preferred their independence, and some of them, connected with noblemen who held decidedly anti-cardinalist opinions, were afraid lest by accepting the Prime Minister's offer they should be suspected of betraying their protector's interests and of wishing to act as spies. However, A desire expressed by Richelieu was almost equivalent to an order, and the Académie Française was established by letters patent dated July 10th, 1637. We have already alluded to the opposition raised by the Paris Parliament against this new creation of the cardinal. The resistance was absurd, no doubt, but it proved that the general feeling suspected Richelieu of wishing to stifle independence even in literature, and of carrying his despotic views beyond the limits of politics strictly so called. It is not the place to examine here how far the creation of the Académie Française has been favourable to the progress of taste and of elegant composition. We shall merely say that the protector of the new institution, anxious to shine as an homme de lettres as well as a statesman, wrote several tragi-comedies which still exist, and of which it would be difficult to say whether the language or the plot is more ridiculous. The one called Mirame was brought out in 1639 on a theatre built in the Palais Cardinal on purpose, at a great expense. It could be performed only twice, as even his most ardent supporters could not get up enthusiasm enough to admire a play where the scenery alone was a success. Well, Frenchmen never had taste. Such is the remark which Richelieu philosophically made to his collaborateur Desmarets on seeing the indifference exhibited by the audience to the destinies of the unfortunate Mirame. Richelieu's influence on literature must not be measured by the fate which awaited his wretched plays. It is not too much to say that for the space of 20 years he was the centre not only of the political but of the intellectual world. Around him, as around their guide and their protector, we find the busy crowd of parliamentary orators, historians, memoir writers, gazetteers, legists. He understood nothing, it is true, about dramatic composition, but he protected the drama, and his encouragement of literature possessed this good quality, that it was not limited to a coterie or guided by jealousy. Richelieu, besides, as a littérateur, has other titles than those of a poet. Let the reader turn, for instance, to the History of the States General, 1614, and let him study the speech which the Bishop of Luçon, Richelieu, made in his capacity as deputy of the clergy. Its merits are all the more apparent because they stand out in strong contrast to the heaviness, the stilted and affected mannerism of those which were delivered by the orators of the nobility and the bourgeoisie. Richelieu, as an excellent critic very appropriately observes, spurns college declamation, scholastic pedantry, and a useless display of erudition. His language is clear, precise, remarkable by its manliness. He goes at once to the end he has in view, and allows no obstacle to stop from his purpose. He speaks with the twofold authority of a bishop and of a politician. Those who wish to become acquainted with Richelieu as a writer must leave entirely aside his theological and controversial works, Ordonnances synodales, les principaux points de la foi catholique défendus contre l'édit et dressés au roi par les ministres de Charenton, Poitiers, 1617, 8 volumes, Instruction du chrétien, Poitiers, 1621, 8 volumes, La méthode la plus facile est assurée de convertir ceux qui sont séparés de l'Église, Paris, 1651, folio. They must direct their attention to the numerous memoirs which the cardinal composed on contemporary affairs, and especially to his voluminous correspondence, which enables us to complete what history tells us about his character, and not unfrequently to correct certain impressions which we have almost unwittingly accepted on the authority of tradition. Thus we know the severity of the minister, his inflexible determination to punish his enemies, and to mow down every obstacle which stood in his way. We accordingly expect, on perusing his letters, to find expressions of blame and reproach freely indulged in, and visiting the smallest offence. Quite the contrary. Richelieu often pretends to ignore faults and petty neglects of duty which he does not want to punish. If he has to complain of a general, he leaves the care of writing to one of his secretaries, who informs the culprit that the accusing dispatch has been concealed from the prime minister. When the necessity for chastisement is beyond a doubt, the blow falls, and falls heavily. But if a mere reprimand is all that is wanted, Richelieu takes the utmost care not to crush the zeal of the offender by letting him feel that there is no possible room for pardon. The Succincte Narration des Grandes Actions du Roi is a work of the utmost interest, for whilst the correspondence conjures up before our eyes the cardinal in his non-official and familiar character, we have here the statesman who appeals to posterity, the historian who gives a faithful and dignified account of his stewardship. The very title of the work arrests our attention at first. We see Richelieu anxious to save the susceptibilities of the monarch, whose pliable will it was his business to mould, and to whom he dexterously ascribes the honour of high deeds which would never have been accomplished if the directing thought and the acting hand had been those of La Vieuville or de Luynes or a Concini. We may consider the Succincte Narration as a splendid piece of apologetic composition, where facts instead of arguments plead Richelieu's cause and justify him at the tribunal of posterity. The Testament politique is the necessary complement of this work. It was evidently drawn up by the order and under the direction of the cardinal, but by the hand of a secretary, and although the genius of Richelieu has left its mark upon certain portions of the narrative, and even certain details, it is tolerably clear that it did not receive from end to end the benefit of the master's revision and correction. Richelieu, we have already had occasion to say, possessed no small share of literary conceit. Just as for his dramatic composition he did not spurn the assistance of complaisant collaborateurs, so in the preparation of his memoirs he secured the assistance of writers such as Vialard, Marshal d'Estrees, and D'Agen. But he reserved for himself the pleasure of reducing into shape the materials which these persons had brought together. And in one of his letters he alludes with a certain amount of naive vanity to the pleasure he felt in representing, that is, giving an artistic shape, what had been the result of a great deal of toil and trouble. We have reserved for the last a curious work which created a great sensation when it was first published. We allude to the well-known Histoire de la Mère et du Fils, ascribed in the first instance to the historian Mézeray, but clearly and conclusively proved to have been Richelieu's own work. If we study in chronological order the innumerable documents and pièces justificatives which the cardinal has taken care to bequeath to us, we can now form a very adequate idea both of his character and of the events with which he was so closely mixed. We see him at first modest and humble, ready to accept all the objections raised against him by his correspondents, flattering and humouring everyone, and submitting to the humiliating necessities of political ambition. As he goes on, he becomes bolder. He ventures to give his opinion, to assert his own dignity, and when he has at last reached the position of a prime minister, he makes the weak Louis XIII speak as Henry IV himself would have done. The age of Richelieu offers to the researches of historical students a number of memoirs and political pamphlets, which, although not particularly noticeable in point of style, deserve to be mentioned as important contributions toward the annals of a busy epoch. We may name here the autobiographies of La Vieuville, the Duc de Rohan, the Marshal d'Estrees, Pontchartrain, Bassompierre, Fontenay-Marie, and Montglat. The professed historian of the time was Scipion Dupleix, who, taking up and recasting the work of Charles Bernard, an obscure compiler, reduced it into shape and made of it a panegyric of the cardinal. The proofs, it is even said, were corrected by Richelieu. Pamphlet literature, as may naturally be supposed, was extremely prolific. Not that attacks against the government could be printed in France, but they either circulated in manuscript or were published in Holland, in Lorraine, in Germany. On the one side, Sirmont, Rollet du Châtelet, Mézeray; on the other, Father Chanteloube, Mathieu de Morgue, took up their pens respectively for and against the minister. Richelieu himself, if the report is true, not scorning to play the part of a satirist in the Mot à l'oreille and La France mourante. It would be difficult to find a spark of wit in these ephemeral productions. Le Pacifique, le Censeur, le Philotémie, le Confiteor du Henri IV, le Miroir de la France, le Cour royale des Tuileries, le Caquet, l'Anticaquet, le Caquet des Familles, etc., etc. But they illustrate very well the state of public opinion, and they form the connecting link between the pamphlets published during the League and the Mazarinades. There is an anecdote on record that Richelieu ordered some colporteurs to read out on the Pont Neuf, in a loud voice, a violent pamphlet in which he was accused of every possible crime, together with the answer he made to his enemies, thus showing that he did not fear the verdict of France on his administration at home and his policy abroad. Voiture's Lettre sur la prise de Corbie is undoubtedly, from every point of view, the most remarkable of the political works composed in defence of Cardinal Richelieu. Written in a serious and eloquent tone, inspired by true patriotism, it is a masterpiece, and will outlive the amusing but tiresomely witty effusions which amused so much Madame de Rambouillet and Mademoiselle Paulet. In connection with this part of our subject, we must just mention Théophraste Renaudot, who, having obtained the patent of physician to the king, contrived to ingratiate himself with the prime minister, and obtained from him the twofold privilege of opening a sort of registrar's office for advertisements, notices of sales, etc., and of publishing under the title La Gazette de France a weekly paper which met at once with the greatest success. Newspaper literature may be said to date from the commencement of the 17th century. It made its appearance simultaneously, or very nearly so, in England, in France, and in Germany, under the influence of the same causes and as the result of the same requirements. At that time there was a universal desire of obtaining accurate and detailed intelligence of all the events of the day, and when Renaudot made his début as a journalist, he was perfectly amazed at the number of gazettes or journals which were clandestinely distributed, and the contents of which were generally narratives of some court scandal or vulgar piece of gossip. They were known by the name of Nouvelles de la Main, and so eagerly sought for that a whole class of literary bohemians lived exclusively by collecting from all quarters, and very frequently composing news and intelligence of the most miscellaneous character. Some of these gazettes were printed, others were circulated in manuscript. The popularity obtained by these early newspapers increased so rapidly that no circle, no coterie, no club was without its office, where news, both home and foreign, were collected, copied, and forwarded to subscribers who paid a sum proportionate to the size of the paper. End of section 24. Section 25 of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8, Literature, Part 3. We can easily imagine that a man like Renaudot, ingenious, intelligent, having travelled and observed much, saw the great advantages which must infallibly result from the regular publication of a newspaper carefully edited and containing reliable details on daily occurrences at home and abroad. Besides, the journal thus conceived and carried out would prove for the government, or rather for the Prime Minister, an admirable help and a means of stopping all the scurrilous pamphlets which were so plentifully distributed. Being issued distinctly cum privilegio, it feared no competition, and no one would dare entering the lists against a journalist who, for aught one knew, might be Richelieu himself. A further circumstance pointed to Renaudot as the natural rédacteur en chef of the projected newspaper. The registrar's office, which he had opened, was a fertile source of intelligence and gossip, and he had been obliged to set up a printing press, for which ample work would now be regularly provided. On the 30th of May, 1631, a decree was issued by His Majesty granting to Théophraste Renaudot, one of our councillors and physicians in ordinary, master and superintendent of the registrar's office, bureau d'adresse, of the realm, and likewise to his children, descendants, and trustees, the privilege of collecting, printing, editing, and selling wheresoever and by the agency of whomsoever he pleases, the news, gazettes, and narrative of whatever has taken or is at present taking place both within and without the kingdom, interviews, conferences, prices current, etc. The privilege is granted in perpetuity, that is, so long as the aforesaid gazettes, news sheets, and other prints are circulated in France, to the exclusion of all other persons. The first number of the Gazette de France is supposed to have been issued on the same day as the royal edict. It assumed from the beginning a political character. "This is," said Renaudot in its preface, "the journal of the kings and powers of the earth." The discussion of political questions in those days was a dangerous thing, unless the views adopted were in strict accordance with the line prescribed both by the eminence rouge and the eminence grise. But Renaudot had very wisely taken the safe side, and at the end of 2 years' time as a journalist, he was in a position to say to foreign powers that it was no use their endeavouring to prevent intelligence from their respective countries from reaching the office of the Gazette de France. "It is," said he, "a merchandise the trading in which has never been successfully prohibited, and it participates in the nature of a torrent, inasmuch as it merely increases by the resistance offered to it." From historical literature we pass on to tales, novels, and romances, which are in a certain degree branches of the same family, for they are, so to say, photographs of society, and throw much curious light upon the manners, customs, feelings, and aspirations of the day. Mademoiselle de Scudéry's Grand Cyrus was even more than that. 200 years before the author of Waverley had produced his immortal works, it realized the idea of an historical novel, and the laborious researches of the late M. Victor Cousin have proved that the adventures of Cyrus, his battles and his exploits of various kinds, are nothing else but a wonderfully accurate description of the Duc d'Enghien's military career, and of the brilliant successes with which he inaugurated the minority of Louis XIV. From the battlefield of Lens, where the concluding scenes of the 30 Years' War were being enacted, Mademoiselle de Scudéry takes us to the Paris Salon and introduces us to the habitués of the Hôtel de Rambouillet. Then it is that she appears as Sappho, and around her we find Cléomire, Madame de Rambouillet herself, the adorable Cléonide, Julie d'Angennes, the beautiful Anacrise, Clarisse her sister, the wonderful Élise, Mademoiselle Paulet, the generous Mégabat, the Duc de Montausier, the illustrious Magus of Sidon, Godeau, Bishop of Grasse, the agreeable Cléarch, Voiture, the wise Théodamas, Conrart, and the admirable Aristée, Chapelain. Ogier de Gombault, La Colprenède, and Gomberville also contributed their share to the literature of novels and romances. The Endymion of the first of these writers, utterly worthless in point of style, owes its reputation to the fact that whilst pretending to relate the well-known classical story, Gombo really expressed his ridiculous passion for the Queen Mary de' Medici, then somewhat on the wane, and whose 50 years no artifice could possibly conceal. Having one day to ask a favour of one of the influential personages in attendance upon Cardinal Richelieu, Marin le Roy, Sieur de Gomberville, Thalassius Basilides à Gomberville, as he was fond of styling himself, engaged a street porter for the purpose of carrying a complete set of his works. La Charité, 1621, Polexandre, 1632 to 1637, La Citerée, 1640 to 1642, and La Jeune Alcidiane, 1651, were no doubt 2 centuries ago very famous romances, much in request at the Hôtel de Rambouillet. But who has ever heard them even mentioned except Polexandre, which is indebted for its success principally to the circumstance that it describes the relations between France and Spain, and that it deserves to a certain extent a place in the list of historical romances. Gomberville had besides conceived for the conjunction car so intense an aversion that he boasted of not having made use of it once in his 4 volumes, substituting everywhere instead the phrase puisque. It was this singularity which suggested to Voiture the witty letter addressed to Mademoiselle de Rambouillet, in which he took the defence of the threatened conjunction. Le Calprenède may be named also amongst the authors of long-winded, pseudo-heroic romances. His Cléopâtre and his Cassandre have not even the merit of being well written. The style has neither character nor energy, and the wonder is that to the 7 volumes of his unfinished Pharamond, an enthusiastic continuator should have had the patience to add 5 others. Against these imitations of Spanish literature a reaction was inevitable. The stilted, unnatural, and tedious romances of the Précieux school became so insufferable in their dullness that many attempts were made with much success in a diametrically opposite direction. Charles Sorel's Histoire comique de Francillon is not very edifying, certainly, but it is extremely amusing, and not infrequently makes us think of Lesage's Gil Blas. Sorel was born for opposition. His Francillon, says M. Colombet, is a kind of Fronde, of which Honoré d'Urfé was the Mazarin. We have had, we quote from the preface, tragic histories enough to sadden us. Let us now have one of a comic kind, and capable of giving pleasure to the gloomiest minds. The Hôtel de Rambouillet, Ménages Mercuriales, Mademoiselle de Scudéry, did not inspire the slightest respect to the clever satirist. He even attacked the heroes of the day, Balzac and Voiture, for whom he had no more esteem than for a couple of fiddlers. By an amusing contrast, the Histoire comique de Francillon was published the same year as the 2nd volume of L'Astrée and as the Citerée of Gomberville. It went through 60 editions in the space of 40 years, and each edition was augmented to a considerable extent by fresh stories which Sorel, or the Sieur du Parc as he pseudonymously styled himself, kept making up as he went on through life, observing the manners, foibles, and ridicules of his fellow Parisians. It is very much to his credit that nothing would induce him to speak of the clergy or of religion, but in terms of the greatest respect. Noblemen, officers, magistrates, literary characters, précieux and précieuses, all the various types of French society crowd his pages and receive his hits, which are dealt with no unsparing hand. The Church alone escapes. If the curés, incumbents, misbehave themselves, he says somewhere, the bishops are at hand to reprove them. It is no business of mine. Théophile de Villot has also published, under the title of Fragments d'une histoire comique, a few chapters which portray real talent, and which, in point of wit, humour, and style, are far superior even to Francillon. Scarron's Roman comique and his Virgile travesti are posterior chronologically, but they belong to the same school and may be regarded as masterpieces of their kind. In the domains of poetry, when we have named Malherbe's two disciples, Racan and Maynard, there is no author of any merit who really deserves a mention, for a few madrigals, sonnets, bourrimets, and epigrams are not sufficient to immortalize Benserade, Sarrazin, and Godot. This last named rhymester, after having during his youth composed a number of love songs, committed them all to the flames, and set about paraphrasing the psalms and the hymns of the Roman breviary. His version of the Benedicite pleased Richelieu so much that he conferred upon the author the bishopric of Grasse. Vous me donnez Benedicite, said he in his most amiable manner, et je vous donne grâce, grace. The quality of the pun was doubtful, but the gift was not the less acceptable. Chapelain is perhaps the most celebrated of Boileau's victims. The author of L'Art Poétique asks why he would persist in writing poetry. The question might, we think, be modified so far as to express a doubt whether Chapelain should have written at all. The work which has held him up to ridicule is the famous Pucelle, which it took him 5 years to meditate, and which he sketched in prose before writing a single line of it. The first 12 cantos, published in 1656, went through 6 editions in 18 months. But this fit of enthusiasm did not last, and the remaining portion of the epic is still in manuscript. The critic Montmort composed on the poem the following Latin epigram: Illa campellani dudem expectata puella, postanta in lucem tempora prodit annus. Thus rendered into French by Lignières: Nous attendions de Chapelain une pucelle jeune et belle. 20 ans à la forge il perdit son latin, et de sa main il sort enfin une vieille sempiternelle. The want of originality and of vigour which characterizes all the productions we have just been naming is equally conspicuous in the dramatic works of Maret and Desmarets. We have already seen Richelieu attempting to establish his reputation as a composer of tragedies. Having neither the time, nor, let us add, the talent, to shine in that direction, he had engaged as his collaborateurs 5 authors, Colté, Boisrobert, L'Étoile, Rotrou, and Corneille, who constituted what was called La Brigade du Cardinal, or l'Académie de Campagne. To these he dictated his sketches, suggested subjects, and explained his conceptions of character, dialogue, and scenery. The results were very far from satisfactory. In his repertoire of upwards of 500 plays, Garnier had the merit, at any rate, of riveting the interest of the audience by startling episodes which atoned for the wretched meanness of his style. Méret's Sophonisbe, written according to the strictly classical recipe, was a great improvement. Raquin's Bergeries are tediousness itself. Théophile de Villot's Pyrame et Thisbe transferred on the stage the vocabulary of the Précieuses, and, as M. Demégeo wittily remarks, made of the Hôtel de Bourgogne an echo of the Hôtel de Rambouillet. There it is that the famous couplet occurs: Ah, voici le poignard qui du sang de son maître s'est souillé lâchement, il en rougit le traître. It was impossible that all this extravagance should last. The author to whom belongs the merit of having put an end to it was Desmarets. In his play Les Visionnaires he held up to ridicule all the nonsense which passed current at the Hôtel de Rambouillet, and if his descriptions and sketches of character too often strike us as decidedly broad, it may be answered that the puerilities which had so long been accepted as masterpieces of genius deserved not the honour of serious criticism, but merely to be laughed off the stage. We must not grudge a short notice to Alexandre Hardy Parisien, to quote his favourite designation, a dramatic author absolutely destitute of genius, but who understood the art of writing sensational pieces and amusing the play-going public. For want of originality, he borrowed wherever he could the subjects of his tragi-comedies. History, mythology, Italian and Spanish novels, everything was fish which came to his net, and he was thus able to produce, some say 6, others 800 plays. Out of that large number, only 41 have been published, quite enough to give an idea of Hardy's style. We have seen in our own time Alexandre Dumas' Three Musketeers taking 2 soirées in the performance. Alexandre Hardy taxed the patience of his friends for 8 successive nights when his tragedy, Theagenes and Chariclea, was brought out. It is nothing else but the romance of Heliodorus reduced into the shape of a dialogue and acted instead of being read. Our friend M. Desmaugeot reminds us that when this drama was performed, 1601, it was not long since mysteries and miracle plays were acted, all quite as long and almost as tedious. Theagenes and Chariclea might be considered in the light of a secular mystery and judged according to the same standard. Hardy cared nothing for propriety, style, taste, and correctness. His ars poetica consisted in filling the house. The box-keeper was his Apollo. He could dash off 2,000 lines in 24 hours. It is true that a 5-act tragedy, comedy, or tragicomedy brought him, on an average, 3 crowns. Under such pecuniary difficulties, it would be wrong to find fault with Hardy, either as a thinker or a writer. It is not everyone who can afford to be classical at the rate of 5 shillings an act. Only Rotrou and Pierre Corneille remain to be noticed. We have seen that they both belonged to the Académie de Campagne, and it is not difficult to determine the share they had respectively in the dramatic works of the 5 authors. They had sufficient genius, however, to cast away the collaboration even of the cardinal, and there is no doubt that Corneille's impatience of the yoke was the chief cause of the cabal raised against the Cid when that admirable tragedy, or tragicomedy as it was called, first appeared. The early plays of the author, La Veuve, La Suivante, La Place Royale, La Galerie du Palais, L'Illusion, etc., were composed too decidedly after the prevailing taste to excite the jealousy of other dramatists. But the Cid gave evidence of such superiority that Richelieu's self-love for once took the alarm. He encouraged Scudery and his coterie to run down the new candidate for literary fame, and ordered the Académie Française to write a critique of the play, which was exciting so much attention. Maret and Boisrobert felt bound, of course, to side with their protector, and Chapelain drew up the bill of accusation. But, much to the credit of the academicians, the Sentiment de l'Académie sur le Cid, despite several reservations, proved really a panegyric, and Corneille, encouraged by the enthusiasm with which his tragedy had been received, continued to write for the stage. Horace, Cinna, Polyeucte, Le Menteur, Pompey, all belonged to the reign of Louis XIII. Rotrou was chronologically anterior to Corneille, but as a matter of fact he must be regarded as his disciple. For whereas Le Cid bears the date of 1636, those amongst Rotrou's works which deserve to be mentioned, Saint Genest, Veneslas, Cosroes, were written 10 years later. The difference we find between the compositions of these 2 poets and those of their contemporaries does not reside so much in the source from which they borrowed their subjects as in the treatment of these subjects. Wenceslas and Le Cid, for instance, are taken from the Spanish just as much as Georges de Scudery's Amour tyrannique, but whereas the Précieux dramatists laid the principal stress on a complicated plot and on startling incidents, Rotrou, and especially Corneille, made all the interest derived from the characters themselves and from the struggle between passion and duty. Descartes had accomplished a revolution in philosophy. The author of the Cid brought about one quite as important in dramatic literature. The attention they both excited at first served to prove that they thoroughly understood the intellectual requirements of the age in which they lived, and the high esteem in which they are still held after a lapse of more than 2 centuries shows that their success was not due to fashion and caprice. End of Section 25. Section 26 of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9, Fine Arts, General Summary, Part 1. In his amusing play Le Menteur, Corneille introduces a country gentleman coming to Paris after a long absence, and expressing his admiration of the improvements he sees everywhere. Paris semble à mes yeux un pays de Romains. Je croyais ce matin voir une île enchantée. Je la laissais désertée et la trouve habitée. Quelqu'un fit un nouveau, sans l'aide des maçons. Un superbe palais a changé les buissons. Allowing, of course, for a little exaggeration natural to poets, this description is tolerably correct. Political matters had so completely absorbed the attention of Henry IV that he had very little time to bestow upon details of material embellishments, or even sanitary importance, in connection with the then already large city of Paris. And at his death, traces of the wars and of the domination of the League were still apparent in too many places. No sooner had Richelieu risen to power than his influence was felt in questions of municipal organization, as well as of war, legislation, and finance, and the historian Sauval, Antiquité de Paris, Volume 1, page 236, tells us that this incomparable man delighted no less in embellishing Paris than his own birthplace. He went so far as to insist upon examining the plans of all the public buildings before sanctioning their construction. The result was the metamorphosis alluded to by Dorant in the extract from Corneille, which we have quoted above, and which is confirmed by his father Géronte in the following manner. Paris voit tous les jours de ces métamorphoses. Dans tout le préau clair, tu verras même chose. Et l'univers entier ne peut voir rien d'égal au superbe abord du palais cardinal. Toute une ville entière, avec pompe bâtie, semble d'un vieux fossé par miracle sorti. Without attempting to go through all the particulars of the improvements made by Richelieu, we may just say a few words about the palace here named, and which, under the modified designation of Palais Royal, has played so conspicuous a part in the history not only of the metropolis but of France. It was originally a mansion of very unpretending appearance, built in 1629 for Richelieu by the architect Le Mercier. Situated at the extremity of Paris, Rue Saint-Honoré, near the city walls, which dated as far back as Charles V, it had nothing in the way of beauty to recommend it above the Hôtel of the Nobility. But the owner soon found it too small, and the boundaries of the city having been pulled down, it was extended in the direction of the Rue Vivienne, while further purchases carried it out toward the side now occupied by the Rue Richelieu and the Rue des Bons Enfants. The death of the cardinal prevented the complete realization of his plans, which included a hall destined for the meetings of the Académie Française, and apartments for all the academicians. Amongst the most interesting features of the Palais Cardinal was a gallery named La Galerie des Hommes Illustres, decorated with portraits of the following personages: Suger, Simon de Montfort, Gaucher de Châtillon, Du Guesclin, Olivier de Clisson, Boucicaut, Dunois, Joan of Arc, Georges d'Amboise, Louis de la Trémule, Gaston de Foix, Bayard, Charles de Cossé, Duc de Brissac, Anne de Montmorency, François de Lorraine, Duc de Guise, the Cardinal de Lorraine, Blaise de Montluc, Armand de Gontaut-Biron, Lesdiguières, Henri IV, Marie de Medici, Anne of Austria, Gaston d'Orléans, and Richelieu himself. Marble busts were placed in the intervals between these portraits, which had been painted by Champagne, Vouet, Juste d'Egmont, and Poussin. On the 6th of June, 1636, the cardinal made over his palace to Louis XIII, subsequently confirming the donation by his will, dated Narbonne 1642. Two of the most valuable creations, the merit of which belongs to Richelieu, are the Royal Printing Establishment and the Jardin Royal des Plantes, or Botanical Garden. Let us glance at them in succession. Francis I, as is well known, had given to every branch of literature the most powerful impulse, and amongst other subjects he had not neglected the development and perfection of printing. Unfortunately, the religious wars of the 16th century both stopped the progress encouraged by him, who had been justly called le père des lettres, and even deprived France of the treasures which it already possessed. Thus, while the Medici family, those enlightened protectors of literature, science, and art, owned in Rome a printing press amply supplied with Oriental characters, it would have been quite impossible at the beginning of the reign of Henry IV to publish in Paris any book necessitating the use of Hebrew, Arabic, or Persian type. Louis XIII resolved upon supplying this desideratum, and he did so with an amount of energy and persistency which reflect upon him the greatest credit. In 1589, a certain Savary de Brève, Marquis de Maulevrier, equally celebrated as a diplomatist and a scholar, had been sent to Constantinople, where he represented France for the long space of 22 years. Thanks to his skill and to his acquaintance with Eastern literature, he enjoyed the most extraordinary influence at the court of the Sultans Amurath III, Mohammed III, and Ahmed I, and made use of that influence in the first place to procure to France political advantages, and secondly, to help on the cause of erudition and literature. Having purchased a large number of splendid manuscripts, he caused to be engraved from them sets of Arabic, Syriac, Persian, and Turkish type, the execution of which was entrusted, some say, to a celebrated workman named Lebet. It seems, however, more probable that these characters were engraved in the Levant, for de Brève left Constantinople only in 1611, and 15 months later he started for Rome, taking with him his typographical establishment. When there, he published as early as 1613 an Arabic translation of Cardinal Bellarmine's Catechism, and also an Arabic version of the Book of Psalms, with the following indication on the title page: Ex typographia Sawariana. Now, the stay of the French ambassador in Paris was too short to admit of his having been able to get all the type he required cast and prepared there. If, therefore, Lebet had any share in the undertaking, it must have been quite unimportant. The death of Savary de Brève, 1627, very nearly deprived France of the result of his unremitting labours, for his heirs determined upon putting up his printing presses, fonts of type, etc., for sale by auction. Both English and Dutch were competing for the purchase of them, when in 1632 Cardinal Richelieu directed Antoine de Vitré, printer to the king and the clergy, to buy at any cost all the coveted treasures, and for the relatively small sum of 4,300 livres they were finally secured to the nation. A few years before, Soublé de Noailles had been refused 27,000 livres as the price of them. However immense all these resources were for the progress of learned printing in France, Louis XIII was not yet satisfied. He commissioned in 1632 the same Antoine de Vitré to procure at the expense of the royal exchequer some Armenian and Ethiopian type, for the engraving of which Vitré made a bargain with a well-known type founder, Jacques de Senlec, who had applied himself to the study of Oriental lore. Money difficulties unhappily prevented, for a season, the carrying out of the king's intention so far as the Ethiopian type was concerned, and in order to avoid a lawsuit, Antoine de Vitré found himself compelled to become personally responsible for the Armenian characters which he had already received from Jacques de Senlec. He further retained for several years the printing materials left by Savary de Brève, along with the Greek type cast according to the order of Francis I, and made use of them for the purpose of bringing out President Leger's Polyglot Bible. We shall not enter here into the details of the difficulties which arose between the government and poor Antoine de Vitré about the possession and the payment of these various fonts. Our business is merely to state briefly the different steps which led to the organization of the Royal Printing Office, and we notice that in the year 1631 Cardinal Richelieu was entrusted with the direction and management of printing so far as breviaries, missals, and other church services were concerned. He received permission to select from the printers and publishers of the metropolis 18 competent persons who should form a typographical society protected by a royal privilege, on the express condition of their issuing the New Testament, church catechisms, and grammars in the idioms of the Levant. A certain number of copies were to be given gratuitously to missionaries and to such converts as might be recommended. The society we are now alluding to did not realize all the hopes which Richelieu had entertained. The publishers, very naturally, made a selection from the manuscripts submitted to them, and printed these alone which they thought might likely to bring in a reasonable profit. Other causes of dissatisfaction also appeared, and finally, in 1640, acting under the inspiration of the cardinal, Louis XIII ordered the formation of a printing office, to which he gave the name of Imprimerie Royale. The following inscription commemorates this really important event. Anno mirabili, 1640, Casali servato, attrabate expugnato, taurino recuperato, hostibus terra marique fusis, regia prole ad saeculi felicit, aucta. Stupente orbe Ludovicus Justus, nequid sui nominis gloriae deesset, sualente musarum fautore, se de Richelieu, typographium in aedibus regiis collocavit. It would be idle to conceal that the foundation of the Imprimerie Royale, independently of the services it was called on to render to literature, was regarded by the wily cardinal as another and powerful means of carrying on his despotic government, and we have no doubt that this motive was paramount in his mind. 20 years later we find in another official document that the royal printing press was established for the purpose of giving to the public the works of good authors printed in type worthy of their merit. Such are the expressions of the order of 1660, confirming the creation of the Imprimerie Royale, and all readers acquainted with French literature know how thoroughly the state printing press in Paris has ever since deserved its reputation. The offices were at first established in the Louvre, on the ground floor, immediately below what is now the principal picture gallery. The administrator and general superintendent was Soublé de Noailles, who, appointed to the Secretaryship of War since 1633, had also been named in 1638 director of the royal buildings and manufactures. Sébastien Cramoisi, the most distinguished publisher of his time, received the nomination of principal printer, whilst the responsible part of corrector was given to Tréchet Dufresne, a savant of great reputation as a numismatist and book collector. Tanneguy Lefebvre, father of the well-known scholar Madame Dacier, and a great friend of Richelieu, held the office of inspector with a salary of 2,000 livres. Eminent artists were engaged to draw the frontispieces and other ornaments, and Poussin, who was one of them, complains, in a letter addressed to the Commendatore del Pozzo, that the extreme ease with which he executed these trifling sketches caused him to be in very great request, and prevented him from finding time for more serious works. The types used were cast with the utmost care, and after a great deal of negotiation, the French government contrived to get back from Geneva the set of Greek characters alluded to above, which had been cast in Paris under the superintendence of Robert Estienne by the celebrated Claude Garamond, at the express command of King Francis I, and which therefore really belonged to the nation. These, together with the materials accumulated by Savary de Brève and Antoine de Vitré, enabled His Majesty's printers to start under the best possible conditions, and if we believe Sauval, the learned historian of Paris, the results obtained merely during the first 2 years surpassed every expectation. The Jardin Royal des Plantes has already been mentioned as one of the most noteworthy foundations of the reign of Louis XIII. For many years there had existed an official known by the name of Herboriste du Roi, whose business it was to collect and cultivate medicinal plants. The garden he had under his direction was ridiculously small. The collection never exceeded 200 specimens, and the modest salary affixed to the post was entirely absorbed by the purchase and carriage of plants, the correspondence entailed by these purchases, etc., etc. The duties of Herboriste du Roi had been exercised during a period of upwards of half a century by Robin and his son Vespasien Robin. When Guy de la Brosse, physician in ordinary to the king, conceived the thought of transforming entirely the Jardin Royal des Plantes, and of making it both a scientific and charitable establishment, he wanted to regenerate medicine by the study of botany, and at the same time to form a garden where sick people in straitened circumstances might purchase at a cheap rate the plants necessary for their different cases. Guy de la Brosse seems to have been a remarkable man in every respect. Like the most illustrious amongst his contemporaries, he saw the necessity of throwing off the trammels of routine, and of substituting the method of observation in scientific subjects for the easy but unsatisfactory dictates of tradition. His Traité de la nature des plantes, dedicated to Cardinal de Richelieu, contains the following striking passage: "If we go against the opinion of the ancients, and if we speak less respectfully of them than their worshippers do, it is not that we hold them in no esteem. They did what they could for the age in which they lived. Let us perform what we can do for ours. So long as we have experience and reason on our side, we shall be the strongest. Truth must needs prevail over the opinion of any individual, whoever that individual may be." As M. Caillet very aptly remarks, these words, written in 1628, make us feel that the author was a contemporary of Kepler, Galileo, and Descartes. They announce the Discours de la méthode, which was to appear 10 years later. At the time we are now speaking of, every endeavour to depart from the old ruts of tradition was considered to be a dangerous heresy. The Diafoirus regime still prevailed through the length and breadth of France, and Guy de la Brosse was made to feel it. Héroulard, first physician to the king, who supported his colleagues' enlightened views, belonged to the Montpellier faculty. How could a Montpellier practitioner dare to foist his novelties upon so learned and ancient a body as the Corporation of the Paris Doctors, and venture within the limits of their domains? Obstacles of every kind were cast in the way of Guy de la Brosse. Fortunately, he numbered amongst his supporters the king, Richelieu, Bouillon, superintendent of the finances, and Séguier, keeper of the seals. So powerfully countenanced, he could not but triumph ultimately. He had presented on the subject of the Jardin Royal des Plantes a first memoir as far back as 1614. But the political disturbances of the time prevented it from receiving the necessary attention, and it was in 1626 only that the edict authorizing the scheme of Guy de la Brosse was granted. It received the sanction, enregistrement, of the Paris Parliament on the 6th of July. The vicissitudes which marked the early stages of the new botanical garden were numerous, but the first impulse had been given, and through a long series of improvements of every kind, the Jardin Royal des Plantes, or Jardin du Roi, reached the condition in which it is at the present day. End of section 26. Section 27 of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9, Fine Arts, General Summary, Part 2. One detail should not be left unnoticed in the narrative of the circumstances connected with Guy de la Brosse's foundation. Louis XIII. Was very fond of botany, and the interest he took in the planning and organization of the botanical garden arose mainly from his own tastes as an amateur gardener. It has been too much the habit to regard the king as a man thoroughly incapable and ignorant. The truth is exactly the reverse. His timidity and constitutional weakness alone prevented him from taking the initiative when he might advantageously have done so, and very luckily for the administration of the kingdom, an able prime minister was at hand to assume the direction of affairs. Louis XIII. Had a very cultivated mind. We have just seen that he understood the science of botany. He had also a decided taste for the fine arts, and was a good connoisseur in painting. He had even taken lessons of Simon Vouet, an artist who possessed more talent than genius, and whose chief glory is to have created the French school, and to have been the teacher of Lesueur and Lebrun. Richelieu himself knew nothing more about painting than he did about poetry, but he understood perfectly well that the encouragement of the fine arts adds to the glory of a nation, and he was a liberal patron of sculptors, painters, engravers, and architects. He offered 40,000 crowns for a picture of the resurrection of Lazarus by Fra Sebastian, painted for the Cathedral of Narbonne. He spent 10,000,000 livres and more on his own Chateau of Richelieu, which before the building of the palace at Versailles was the most splendid structure of the kind in France, and where the cardinal had brought together at an immense cost the choicest masterpieces of ancient and French art. Soublé de Noailles, whom we have already mentioned more than once, was also a distinguished virtuoso, and no one discharged more efficiently than he the office of superintendent of the royal buildings. A result of considerable importance, and which has not generally been noticed, is that the artists honoured with the protection of Richelieu and Louis XIII. Became independent, inasmuch as they had no longer to put up with the vexatious rules and requirements imposed by the guilds to which they belonged. Once more we must observe, at the risk of appearing tedious, that routine was then the all-powerful deity, the ace triplex of restrictions, prohibitions, and cautions which the Middle Ages had erected around theology, metaphysics, natural science, likewise hemmed in even the fine arts, and it was only by sacrificing to the crown a comparatively small amount of this liberty that painters could escape from the more serious despotism of ignorant and narrow-minded men who, under the designation of maîtres jurés peintres et imagiers, claimed the right of deciding who should paint, what subjects should be painted, and on what conditions. 3 painters besides Vouet, already named above, chiefly contributed to the glory of Cardinal Richelieu's administration. They were Poussin, Claude Lorrain, and Philippe de Champagne. Born at Brussels in 1602, Philippe de Champagne cannot be called strictly a Frenchman by nationality, but he came to Paris when very young, lived there nearly all his life, and finally breathed his last there in 1674. In 1627, having managed to quarrel with Duchesne, first painter to the Queen Mother, Philippe de Champagne had retired to Brussels, and was preparing to take up his residence in Italy, when he heard of the death of Duchesne. He then went back to Paris, and on his arrival received a pension of 1,200 livres, together with rooms at the Luxembourg. The Queen Mother directed him to execute the paintings in the chapel of the Carmelites in the Faubourg Saint-Jacques. He did also a considerable amount of work for Richelieu, who esteemed him very highly and treated him with special marks of respect. Philippe de Champagne may be regarded as the painter of Jansenism. His religious sentiments were those of the Port Royalists, and his daughter belonged to the celebrated monastery which numbered among its members La Mère Angélique and Jacqueline Pascal. Champagne had enjoyed such reputation that public opinion had universally designated him for the post of first painter to the king. But Lebrun, thanks to Colbert's influence, was elected, and we are bound to add that his genius was decidedly greater than that of his competitor. Nicolas Poussin was honoured also with the protection of Louis XIII. And Richelieu. He had sent to France from Rome some works which attracted much notice by the evident tokens of genius they displayed. Sublet de Noailles was commissioned by the king to write to Poussin, asking him to return to France. This invitation, accompanied by an autograph letter of Louis XIII., found the painter still hesitating when M. de Chanteloup, a relative of de Noailles, and extremely fond of the fine arts, went to Rome, almost compelled Poussin to leave, and brought him to Paris. The painter has written an account of the journey, from which we borrow a short quotation. "I have performed in very good health the journey from Rome to Fontainebleau. I afterwards came to Paris. Scarcely had I arrived when I saw M. de Noailles, who greeted me most cordially. I was taken by his orders in the course of the evening to the apartments destined for me. It is a small palace, for I must needs call it so, situated in the middle of the garden of the Tuileries. On arriving there, I found the first floor splendidly furnished and supplied with all needful provisions, even to an abundance of firewood and cask of excellent wine 2 years old. For the space of 3 days I have been well treated, together with my friends, at the king's expense. I was then conducted by M. de Noailles to his eminence the Cardinal de Richelieu, who embraced me very affectionately, and shaking me by the hand, said how delighted he was at seeing me." Poussin obtained from the king the title of painter in ordinary and a pension of 3,000 livres. But his stay in France was not long. The favour he enjoyed excited the jealousy of Simon Vouet, Le Mercier, and other artists who caballed against him. Discouraged by the repeated annoyance he had to endure, he returned to Rome in 1642. Claude Gelée, surnamed Le Lorrain on account of his nationality, belongs also to the group of illustrious painters who honoured the French school during the 17th century. His talents as a landscape painter have been universally acknowledged, and the collection of sketches by him belonging now to the Duke of Devonshire are quite enough to show his superiority, even if we had not the 20 pictures which adorn the gallery of the Louvre, and those which may be seen at Dulwich. The severity of Mr. Ruskin's criticisms on the French school of painting makes the following appreciation of Claude very noteworthy. "He had a fine feeling for beauty of form and considerable tenderness of perception. His aerial effects are unequalled. Their character appears to me to arise rather from a delicacy of bodily constitution in Claude than from any mental sensibility. Such as they are, they give a kind of feminine charm to his work, which partly accounts for its wide influence. To whatever the character may be traced, it rendered him incapable of enjoying or painting anything energetic or terrible. Hence the weakness of his conception of rough sea. He had sincerity of purpose, but in common with other landscape painters of his day, neither earnestness, humility, nor love, such as would ever cause him to forget himself. That is to say, so far as he felt the truth, he tried to be true, but he never felt it enough to sacrifice supposed propriety or habitual method to it." Of Poussin, the Oxford graduate thus speaks: The landscape of Nicolas Poussin shows much power, and is usually composed and elaborated on right principles, but I am aware of nothing that it has attained of new or peculiar excellence. In finish it is inferior to Leonardo's, in invention to Giorgione's, in truth to Titian's, in grace to Raphael's. We have already noticed that architecture was extensively cultivated during the reign of Louis XIII. Never, perhaps, had so many fine buildings been erected, so much done for the embellishment of the metropolis. Under the regency of Marie de Medici, a number of convents and private residences, hôtels, were planned and finished. Thus Henri de Lorraine, Duc de Mayenne, had his mansion in the Rue Saint Antoine. The Duc de Crequi boasted of his Rue des Poulies near the Louvre. Marshal d'Ancre inhabited a splendid house in the Rue de Tournon near the Luxembourg. It is now transformed into barracks for the Republican Guard. The Palace of the Luxembourg itself belongs to that epoch, and is one of the most noteworthy evidences of that taste for the fine arts which Marie de Medici had brought over with her from Italy. The Louvre, that palace of the kings of France, had more than once been beautified and enlarged since its origin, but it still retained the chief characteristics of a feudal chateau, and was too gloomy to suit the taste of a princess accustomed to light, to air, and to gracefulness. Marie de Medici, in fact, wanted a palace expressly built for herself, and she commissioned de Brosse, nephew of Androuet du Cerceau, to draw the plans and superintend the building of the new edifice, which is still one of the most elegant monuments of southern Paris. Jacques, or rather Solomon de Brosse, thus called to distinguish him from his uncle, had obtained great reputation by having directed the construction of the Huguenot church at Charenton. He was not the only architect in the family, and several de Brosses in the 16th century had risen to considerable fame through their skill in that profession. Thus Jean de Brosse, generally supposed to be Solomon's brother, filled in 1578 the post of architect secretary to the Queen Marguerite de Navarre, and he had built for her the magnificent hôtel in the Rue des Petits Augustins, which she occupied to the day of her death. Solomon de Brosse has left a great many monuments of his genius and his architectural skill. The aqueduct of Arcueil is his, the chateau of Coulommiers in the province of Brie, and some of the finest Paris hôtels. The porch of the church of Saint Gervais, likewise in Paris, were built from his designs. But the best specimen, if not of his talent, certainly of his ingenuity, was the large hall of the Palais de Justice, which had been destroyed by fire in 1618. The proportions of that hall were of the grandest kind, and it was of the utmost importance that they should be preserved. De Brosse managed this difficult problem with the greatest success, and at the same time he contrived to substitute, instead of the Gothic character of the old structure, a Greco-Roman design more in harmony with the taste of the age. Finally, he very prudently replaced the original wooden roof by a stone one, which minimized considerably the danger of fire. Solomon de Brosse died in 1626. He enjoyed the title of architect to the Queen Mother and to the King, together with a yearly salary of 2,400 livres. We have already alluded in a previous chapter to the reforms which about the beginning of the 17th century took place in the bosom of the Gallican Church. New religious orders were created, the existing ones underwent important modifications, and thus in every instance it was necessary either to provide new buildings or to repair and enlarge those which subsisted then, to say nothing of the restoring of the churches, schools, and monasteries which had been destroyed during the civil wars. In many cases the architects employed belonged to the various religious communities which ordered these constructions. Thus a Jesuit father named Martel Ange supplied the drawings of the Jesuit church in Paris. He had taken as his model the church of the Gesu in Rome, built by Vignola, and considered the finest model of Italian 16th-century architecture. The enumeration of the leading French architects of the reign of Louis XIII must include Pierre Le Mouet, 1591 to 1669, François Mansart, 1598 to 1660, and especially Jacques Le Mercier, 1585 to 1654. This distinguished artist had spent most profitably several years in Italy, when he was appointed architect to the king in 1618, with a pension of 1,200 livres. It is always a difficult and invidious work to have to complete what other people have begun. It generally leads to a fresh application of the famous sic vos non vobis, and calls forth more criticism than commendation. Entrusted with the enlargement and continuation of the Louvre, Le Mercier, however, acquitted himself of his delicate task with such success that he immediately rose to fame, and Cardinal Richelieu left him the sole and exclusive responsibility of the building of the Palais Cardinal. Another work of Le Mercier was the Collège of Sorbonne, more particularly the chapel, which he transformed into the present church, the style of which is both simple and elegant. Let us also name the church of the Convent of the Oratory and the church of Saint Roch, both in Paris. He had, moreover, supplied the plans and made the preliminary arrangements for the erection of the Val de Grâce, but did not live long enough to bring that work to completion. Le Mercier's most formidable rival was François Mansart, whose special qualities were variety and imagination in his plans, and great rapidity in their execution. His principal works are the restoration of the Hôtel Carnavalet in Paris, the Châteaux of Maison, Berny, Bercy, Balleroy, the Hôtel of Conti, Bouillon, Fiébert, etc. Mansart it was who had at first been directed to build the Val de Grâce, but his plans having been found fault with, he firmly refused to alter them, and then the undertaking was given over to Le Mercier. We must not forget in this brief list Clément Mettezeau, 1581 to 1652, the famous constructor of the great dyke which assisted Richelieu so much in the taking of La Rochelle. He was, however, more of an engineer than an architect. Charles Erard, 1606 to 1689, after beginning in the architectural career, ended as a painter. Louis Levaux, who died in 1670, Chief Commissioner of the Highways, Grand Voyer, and Inspector of His Majesty's buildings at Fontainebleau, left also behind him a certain reputation for skill and artistic finish. Frémin de Cotte, Pierre Dubois, Michel Valédo, and Auguste Guillon deserve also to be mentioned. End of section 27. Section 28 of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9, Fine Arts, General Summary, Part 3. From architecture to sculpture, the transition is an easy one. A mere walk through the parks of Versailles, Fontainebleau, and Saint-Germain shows at once how rich the French 17th century was in treasures of that description, to say nothing of the masterpieces preserved in the churches, private residences, and museums. Henry IV, so fond of the fine arts and so liberal in his encouragement of them, had attracted to France a number of distinguished men in every speciality. The unsettled state of the country, however, during the minority of Louis XIII, had the effect of scattering in foreign parts all artists who enjoyed a certain amount of reputation, and at the same time, when Cardinal Richelieu came to power, the only sculptors residing in France were Toussaint Chenu and Guillain, renamed Le Cambrai, from the place of his birth. The former of these artists is chiefly known by the bronze figures which he made for the fountains on the Place de Grève, Paris. Guillain Cambrai, 1581 to 1658, was the author of a monumental tomb designed for the chapel of the Minims. It excited universal admiration at the time when it was first produced, and most of the old historians of Paris allude to it in very flattering terms. Wood carving, required as it was for the decoration of churches, was also much in demand, and the Cambrai artist found continual occupation in that specialty. However able Guylain Cambrai may have been in his art, his reputation rests principally on the pupils he trained, and amongst them a special notice must be reserved for his son Simon Guylain and Jacques Sarrazin, a native of Noyon. These two artists, after having executed some works of an ecclesiastical character, went off together to Italy, with the view of studying the masterpieces of antiquity and of the Renaissance period. At that time, Michelangelo was the maestro whose style was most popular, and whose compositions all students aimed at imitating. The first productions of the two friends executed at Rome were close copies of the great Florentine artist. Sarrazin was fortunate enough to make the acquaintance of Domenichino, to learn painting under his direction, and thus insensibly accustomed himself to a simple and more graceful style of art. Guylain was the first to return to Paris. He soon rose into celebrity and assembled in his studio a large number of pupils, including the two brothers, François and Michel Anguier, who did so much to raise to perfection the French school of sculpture. Guylain's bronze statues of Louis XIII and Anne of Austria are still to be seen at the Museum of the Louvre. He became one of the first founders of the Academy of Painting and Sculpture. Jacques Sarrazin remained in Italy for the space of 18 years. His success there was of the most brilliant description, and it was not without much hesitation that he made up his mind to return to his native country. He found on his arrival that the tide of popularity had turned in favour of a Flemish artist, François Duquesnoy, 1594 to 1646, whose carvings in bronze, marble, ivory, and wood, after having created the most unheard of enthusiasm in Italy, were now much appreciated by the Paris virtuosi. Richelieu, as a matter of fact, was so thoroughly struck by their perfections that he proposed to Duquesnoy to settle in Paris and create there a school of sculpture. Whether the offer was refused or simply forgotten does not appear. At any rate, Duquesnoy died shortly after in Italy, poisoned, it is said, by his own brother. Simon Guylain made a great deal of money by his works. He was extremely active, and besides he employed a number of pupils who carried on his compositions in bronze, marble, wood, and stone. The principal statues, which he did himself, were those of the portal of Saint Gervais. The figures which decorate the high altar of the Minims in the Place Royale, including a magnificent statue of the Virgin. The statues belonging to the portal of the Church of the Sorbonne, and later on, the monument raised to the memory of Louis XIII near the approach to the Pont au Change, Paris. The brothers Anguier remain to be mentioned. They were the sons of a carpenter, and manifested at an early age such a disposition for artistic pursuits that they were sent to Paris with a view of studying under Guylain. François then went to England, where he raised money enough by his talent to enable him to go to Italy. There he made the acquaintance of several eminent painters, such as Poussin, Mignard, Dufresnoy, etc. And after a residence of 2 years in Rome, he returned to Paris and obtained from Louis XIII apartments at the Louvre, together with the post of curator of the Musée des Antiques. The chief works of François Anguier were designed for the Paris churches. They comprise a statue of Cardinal de Bérulle, formerly in the Oratoire Rue Saint-Honoré, a monumental pyramid with trophies, statues, etc., in honour of the Longueville family, and the statue of the Duc de Rohan-Chabot, etc. Some of these compositions are now in the museum of the Petit Augustin. The principal work of Anguier is the mausoleum he raised to the memory of the ill-fated Duc de Montmorency, whose condemnation and death we have previously described. It had been ordered for the convent of the nuns of St. Mary at Moulins, and although it belongs to a later period, 1658, yet as it was his masterpiece, we thought we could not leave it unmentioned. Michel Anguier obtained even more reputation than his brother. He, too, made the classical journey to Italy, but without any resources than those which his talent gave him, and on his arrival at Rome he was fortunate enough to attract the notice of a distinguished artist, who introduced him to some rich families, for whom he did important works, besides contributing to the embellishment of the Church of St. Peter. The productions with which he enriched his native country are posterior to the death of Richelieu, and it is only in 1686 that Michel Anguier died in Paris at the ripe age of 74, after a glorious career as an artist, loved and respected by all who knew him. Metal engraving was particularly encouraged by Louis XIII. And Richelieu. Guillaume Dupré first, and then Jean Véron, his pupil, carried it to a state of perfection which has never been surpassed. And in connection with this part of our subject, we may remark that the whole monetary system of France, then in a state of almost hopeless disorder, was revised and settled upon a proper basis. The catalogue of engravers, properly so called, includes many distinguished artists, such as the two Audran, Karl and Claude, Abraham Busse, and Michel Lannes. Abraham Busse has written on the art of engraving a work which was very popular at the time when it appeared. He treated all sorts of subjects, historical, popular, serious, grotesque, and might be compared to Callot, of whom we shall speak presently, if there were more variety in his compositions, more life, more entrain. We have often admired in museums and private collections the beautiful portraits of historical characters which belong to the early 17th century. Balthazar Montcornet, Tavernier, Henri Chéron, Gabriel Vuillemont are the artists to which we owe these masterpieces. Nor must we imagine that Paris had the monopoly of good engravers. Tours could boast of its Claude Vignon, and Mantes of its Pierre Brabiet, Toulouse of its Hilaire Pradet, Châteauroux of its Nicolas Chapron, Nancy of its Jacques Callot. We have kept for the last Jacques Callot, who combined the qualities of painter, draughtsman, and engraver, and who is perhaps, in the fine arts, the best representative of the reign of Louis XIII. Without being what we should call now a bohemian, Jacques Callot led the life of a merry, easy-going companion, enjoying his days of sunshine, and managing to get without much anxiety through his hours of depression and penury. The early life of Callot was one of the most romantic description. He met with adventures sufficient enough in number and exciting enough in character to supply the materials of a novel. Finally, he settled down at Nancy, his native place, and refusing the brilliant offers made to him by Pope Urbain VIII, of the Emperor Ferdinand, and Louis XIII, he preferred devoting himself entirely to the pursuit of his art in the province where his earliest recollections and affections were centred. The patriotism of Callot was equal to his extraordinary talent. The King of France ordered him to draw and etch the representation of the siege of La Rochelle and the taking of the Isle of Ré. He consented at once, but when he was requested to commemorate in the same manner the siege of Nancy by the French, he refused in the plainest terms. "I had rather," answered he, "cut off my own thumb than do anything contrary to the honour of my prince and my country." So noble an answer could not but commend itself to a monarch who appreciated dignity of character and patriotic feelings. Louis XIII. Immediately offered Callot a pension of 3,000 livres, and a place in the royal household. But the painter was too fond of his liberty to accept even so tempting a proposal, and remained at Nancy, where he died at a comparatively early age. It would take us too long to enumerate Callot's works. We may just say that they are all characterized by an amount of verve we seldom meet with, and the only modern French artist who at all reminds us of him is Charlet. In representing the comic side even of serious subjects, Callot has never been surpassed. He excels in giving us the exaggerated or caricature likeness of the insolent Reiter, the soldier of fortune who followed Wallenstein, Tilly, or Montecuccoli during the vicissitudes of the 30 Years' War, the siege of Magdeburg, and the battle of Lützen. His spirited and delicate etchings are never coarse or vulgar, even when he seems to allow full swing to his wit. In one word, he is par excellence the artist of the early 17th century. His Supplice, his Malheur et Misère de la Guerre, his Gueux contrefaits are the best illustrations possible of the memoirs of Bassompierre, d'Aubigne Baron de Feneste, and Sorel's Histoire de Francion. Callot's works comprise 1,000 pieces, the most striking in point both of conception and execution being La Fête de la Madone de l'Impruneta, the view of the Pont Neuf in Paris, and especially that extraordinary engraving which represents the Temptation of St. Anthony. Music occupied a very prominent part in the pastimes of the court during the reign of Louis XIII. This monarch was himself an excellent musician. On Shrove Tuesday of the year 1618, he danced in a ballet containing a tune which he had composed, and the harmony of which was written by Beauchamp, one of the 24 violins of the royal household. A 4-part song of his, elegantly written and quite correct from the scientific point of view, has been published by Kircher. Several manuscript compositions still exist, testifying to his skill. He wrote a few hunting tunes, and even set to music some of the Psalms. Godot, in his Paraphrase des Psaumes de David, writes as follows: "The late king of glorious memory had not disdained to employ on 4 of my Psalms the perfect knowledge he had of that fine art. These compositions have been published, and the best masters admire them." The fashion of ballet music, which had already manifested itself in France during the reigns of the last 3 Valois and that of Henry IV, rose to a very high standard under Louis XIII. The instrumental resources available were not, of course, what they are today, but the names of several excellent performers on the violin have reached us, more particularly that of Guillaume du Manoir, who delighted Louis XIII so much that the king created for him the office of Roi des Violons, giving him at the same time a patent by virtue of which he could, for a payment of 10 livres, deliver certificates to students and virtuosi, duly qualified to teach, play at concerts, etc., etc. Music, thus encouraged, made rapid progress, and the list of distinguished professionals during the first half of the 17th century is a long and respectable one. End of section 28. Section 29 of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9, Fine Arts, General Summary, Part 4. Architecture, painting, sculpture, drawing, music. We have thus enumerated the various branches of what is generally known by the name of the fine arts. But there are still a few words to be said about the application of these arts to domestic uses, to the embellishment of houses, and to decorative purposes. The epoch of the Valois marked the transition from feudal structures, when everything was sacrificed to the eventualities of war and the necessities of personal safety, to the elegant palaces and hôtels built on the supposition that peace was the normal condition of society, and that the state, not private individuals, had to provide for the means of security at home, as well as against foreign enemies. The building of new mansions in the Renaissance style went on pari passu with the modification and readjusting of old fortresses, so as to meet the requirements of a more civilized and refined state of society. Even in the most celebrated hôtels, anterior in point of date to the era of Louis XIII, the apartments were often badly contrived and awkwardly connected with each other. To the Marchioness de Rambouillet belongs the honor of introducing a complete revolution in the plan and arrangement of houses. She had become the owner of the Hôtel d'Eau in Paris, and thanks to her excellent taste, she transformed it so thoroughly that all persons who wanted to remodel their establishments took as their guide the incomparable Artémise. Even the Queen Marie de Medici directed the architects and workmen employed in building the Palace of the Luxembourg to inspect the Hôtel de Rambouillet and borrow from thence ideas and suggestions for the important work upon which they were engaged. Jean Lapôtre, and after him André Charles Boulle, acquired great and deserved reputation for the elegant style of the furniture which they supplied to the nobility and the haute bourgeoisie. Petitot's enamels have still retained all their value. The French goldsmiths, Balin, Germain, Cousinet, the jewellers, Grégoire, Jacquin d'Ars, and the watchmakers, Gribelin, Jean Toutain, Martineau, Truchet, were equal in skill to the best Italian artists. The celebrated tapestries made at the Gobelins are also identified with a branch of artistic industry which should not be forgotten. They are exclusively or almost exclusively mentioned at the present day, but during the reign of Louis XIII, the Gobelin manufacture found a formidable rival in that of the Savonnerie, established by Dupont and Lourdes, and protected by a privilege granted in 1627. The establishment known under the name of La Savonnerie was nothing else but an hospital, which Marie de Medici created in 1615 for the maintenance of 100 destitute children, whom the two associates had the excellent idea of training to tapestry work. From what we have thus said, we are led to conclude that the claims of Richelieu to the title of protector of literature and art leaves in the shade that of Louis XIV. Here, as well as in the sphere of politics and of administration, the cardinal minister opened the way and removed all the obstacles in such a manner that le grand monarque had only to follow in the track prepared for him. The difficulty and the glory of originating the work of reform belong exclusively to Richelieu. In a letter quoted by M. Guizot, the poet Malherbe thus expresses himself: "You know that my humour is neither to flatter nor to lie, but I swear to you that there is in this man Richelieu a something which surpasses humanity, and that if our bark is ever to outride the tempests, it will be whilst this glorious hand holds the rudder. Other pilots diminish my fear, this one makes me unconscious of it. Hitherto, when he had to build anew or to repair some ruins, plaster alone was put in requisition. Now we see nothing but marble used, and whilst the counsels are judicious and faithful, the execution is diligent and magnanimous. Wit, judgment, and courage never existed in any man to the degree that they do in him. As for interest, he knows none but that of the public. To that he clings with a passion so unbridled, if I may dare so speak, that the visible injury it does his constitution is not capable of detaining him from it. Sees he anything useful to the king's service, he goes at it without looking to one side or the other. Obstacles tempt him, resistance piques him, and nothing that is put in his way diverts him. The disregard he shows of self and of all that touches himself, as if he knew no sort of health or disease but the health or disease of the state, causes all good men to fear that his life will not be long enough for him to see the fruit of what he plants. And moreover, it is quite evident that what he leaves undone can never be completed by any man that holds his place. Why, man, he does a thing because it has to be done. The space between the Rhine and the Pyrenees seems to him not fueled enough for the lilies of France. He would have them occupy the two shores of the Mediterranean and waft their orders thence to the extremest countries of the East. Measure by the extent of his designs the extent of his courage. No wonder that Richelieu thus impressed his contemporaries and fascinated them by his genius. Those who recollected the civil wars, the struggles between the Crown and the League, the despicable weakness of Henry III, and the hard task which fell to the lot of Henry IV, could appreciate, as it deserved, the transcendent mind of the great cardinal. They might detest his policy, but they were completely awed by it, and the very noblemen who joined in the useless plots of Gaston d'Orléans could not help feeling proud at having for their master him who had placed France in the foremost rank of European nations. Any reader who studies attentively the history of France cannot help noticing the progress of monarchical ideas since the 14th century. Between the reigns of Philip Augustus and Philip VI de Valois, a powerful landed aristocracy covered the soil. Gradually it had to make way for the authority of the crown. Bailiffs, seneschals, parliaments, law courts stepped in, taking advantage of every blunder committed by the feudal lords, finding their way to every position their adversaries had been compelled to abandon, and substituting the old Roman theories of government instead of the principles of independence which the Teutonic invaders had brought along with them. From the accession of the Valois to the 16th century, even in the midst of the greatest national calamities, this movement of centralization went on gaining strength day by day, and although for a short space of time during the wars of religion the aristocracy seemed on the point of regaining the power they had lost, the irresistible force of circumstances asserted its rights, and the last vestiges of independence disappeared on the scaffold of 1632 with the ill-fated Montmorency. By ruining forever the power of the nobility, the balance was destroyed between the various elements which composed the state, and no mezzo termine was left between the despotism of the crown and that of the mob. Could this have been avoided? Or must we adopt the conclusion that the French are incapable of self-government? Without attempting to answer this question, we unhesitatingly say that the policy of Richelieu, continued by Mazarin and followed by Louis XIV, produced as its natural result the Revolution, and that every stage in the progress of the Revolution has fatally ended, and must forever end, in the triumph of absolute rule. Richelieu had the great merit of identifying very frequently his own private interests with those of his country. When he was, perhaps, only exercising an act of petty revenge, he seemed to be doing away with some public scandal or eliminating some gross abuse, and his political calculations always helped on his passions, giving them a kind of patriotic sanction. Thanks to Richelieu, the word state was no longer a mere abstraction, but the symbol of national unity. To it, all private interests must yield. Before it, all selfish designs must give way. And when the power and the welfare of France are at stake, everything else is to be held of no account. It is not difficult to see what dangerous consequences such a theory carries along with it. The secret of Richelieu's popularity lies in the fact that he just stopped short of these consequences, and the hearty response which he met with from all those who had the good of the country really at heart amply justifies every act in his administration. Against the sympathies of the bourgeoisie, what are the obstacles which the historian has to enumerate, the elements of resistance which the cardinal had to overcome? His life as an eminent writer very aptly remarks, was a tragic and heroic struggle with great problems and miserable foes, with obstinate meanness, pertinacious treachery, and the worst of all tyrannies, the tyranny of the weak. Supported by his genius, he had to preserve his sway over a prince impatient of a subordinate position, to keep under incessant control an aristocracy always ready to rebel. Nor did the nation even understand the real object of the sacrifices to which he obliged it, and which might at first sight appear both arbitrary and excessive. Seldom has the world seen a more striking instance of what the powerful will of one man can do when it is backed up by superior intellect, and when it is conscious that the aim it has in view is one which can stand the searching scrutiny of public opinion. Amongst real kings, Louis XI., Louis XIV., Napoleon I., Richelieu must ever hold a prominent position. The 18 years during which his administration lasted were for France an epoch of complete transformation. It is no exaggeration to say that at the time when he took in hand the helm of the state, disorder and misrule were at their height. The habits of rebellion and resistance to law resulting from the civil wars of the 16th century had to be eradicated, and the task was not an easy one. The only persons who felt anything like security were those whose profession was arms, and the nobility within the strongholds of their chateaux. But not merely did they have the consciousness of their safety. As they knew no law but violence, no right but might, they made use of their independent power for the purpose of annoying and oppressing the inhabitants of the rural districts. Despotism, as wielded by the aristocracy, crippled agriculture, industry, and trade. The privileged classes crushed those whose labour and productive power constitute the real strength of the nation. Thanks to Richelieu, the pretensions of the noblesse were stamped out, and from his administration date both the real strength of the royal authority and the advent of the bourgeoisie to power. The cardinal, we have already hinted, is often taxed with despotism, and from the point of view of the 19th century, the accusation is not unfounded. But despotism means the stamping out of liberty, and we must remember that during the reign of Louis XIII, liberty did not exist, unless it was the liberty for the upper classes to do what they liked at the expense of the lower ones, and to set themselves above the power of the law. Richelieu delivered the people from the petty tyranny of the aristocracy, inspired them with the sense of their real dignity, and made of them the sinews of the nation. We readily acknowledge that the power of the crown thus rose to a degree which seems to us exorbitant, but such a result was inevitable 200 years ago, especially with the political organization which obtained in France. No more privileges, not even for the clergy. They were, like the aristocracy, to contribute their share to the maintenance of the state and the dignity of the country. Officially connected with the Vatican, they must remember that their first duty was to France, and that as citizens they were answerable not to Rome, but to French tribunals. With Richelieu, Gallicanism was not a word but a reality. In the various departments of education, literature, and art, Richelieu was an intelligent and liberal patron. He reformed the exchequer, encouraged commerce, and introduced into the police and general administration of the state ameliorations which a long series of civil wars had rendered more and more needed. But it is the foreign policy of Richelieu which has chiefly contributed to his glory, and to which no reproach can be addressed, by Frenchmen at any rate. In a short time, notwithstanding the doubts of his friends and the persevering efforts of his enemies, he placed France at the head of the European nations, and by crushing the power of the House of Austria, he rendered to the cause of civilization the most signal of services. In short, he left behind him an army which gave lustre to the early days of the new reign, a fleet quite capable of holding its own against the navies of Holland and of England, finances adequate to face not only the wars but the prodigalities of Louis XIV, agents equal to the task of administering a large and flourishing country, and around the crown itself a prestige which not even the wickedness of Louis XV and the incapacity of Louis XVI could manage to destroy. End of section 29. Read by Pamela Nagami, M.D., in Encino, California, March 2026. End of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson.